The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay guys, here are some facts about the author, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was born in 1927 in Aracata, Colombia, and he is a Colombian novelist and one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Marquez was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982, and he is excellent at writing novels and short stories. His stories are filled with irony and overall humor, and his fiction work introduced readers to magical realism. Magical realism is conventional storytelling with vivid fantasy. One of his most famous novels is 100 Years of Solitude, or Cien Años de Soledad. Okay guys, now we're going to move on to the time period, postmodernism. Postmodernism is from World War II till the present or now, and some characteristics of postmodernism is that it contains a variety of imagery. Marquez uses olfactory and visual imagery to describe the drowned man. In this quotation we have, "He had the smell of the sea about him, and only his shape gave one to suppose that it was the corpse of a human being, because the skin was covered with a crust of mud and scales." We can see that olfactory is being used when the author says he had the smell of the sea, and visual imagery is used when they talk about his body. The skin was covered with a crust of mud and scales.
Another characteristic is that the author uses unrealistic and impossible plots. A handsome man with perfect features coming out from the sea is so unrealistic.
Gosh, no way!
By the way, guys, Gabriel Garcia Marquez originally published this book in 1968.
Finally, symbolism is a big part of postmodernism. Marquez uses flower to represent the lives of the people.
Okay, what's up? Let's move on to cultural context. Marquez was born in Aracataca, Colombia, and he uses his hometown and changes it into a magical, doomed town of Macondo.
Marquez lived in the most violent time due to endless civil wars and dictatorship. Remember, Marquez published this short story in 1968. This was right after World War II. His grandfather was a soldier, and his grandmother told him countless stories of ghosts and the dead. His magical realism style developed from the violent war memories from his grandfather and the ghost stories through his grandmother.
This short story takes place in a fishing village near a sea. The village is comprised of 20 wooden houses that have very little land and no flowers. The characters in this short story include Esteban, who is the handsomest drowned man in the world, and the children in the village and the women and men. Alright, finally we are on to the plot of the story.
The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World opens with a group of children playing on the beach of a small fishing village. In the waves, a dark and shiny bulge is approaching. First, the men think it's a boat, and then they think it's a whale, but then they find out that it's a drowned man covered in seaweed, stones, and dead sea creatures. Instead of going fishing that night, the men leave the body with the women. The women prepare the body for burial. As they clean off the encrusted vegetation, they observe that the material comes from faraway places. The man's shredded clothes also indicate a long ocean voyage. The most astounding thing, however, once the crust is removed, is his handsome appearance.
The oldest woman in the village decides to name the man Esteban because she feels it's the best name suited for him, and all the people in the village agreed.
Instead of going fishing that night, the men head off to neighboring villages to see if the dead man belongs to one of them, while the women clean off the body and prepare it for a funeral. The men visit the neighboring villages with a picture of the dead man, asking if anyone claims them. While no one claims him, they return back to the women to tell them the news. The men return back to the neighboring villages with the news that no one has claimed the drowned men. The women weep for joy as they're so excited to now claim Esteban as their own. The men don't understand what all the fuss is about until the women show them the drowned man's face. Then they, too, are in awe of his handsomeness, his masculinity, and his size. While they admire the drowned man, they think that he must have been ashamed of his size in life and must have felt awkward on account of it. Together, the villagers prepare a splendid funeral for the drowned man after both the men and women see his true beauty. Together, all the villagers come to the man's funeral. When they finally let his body go over the cliff and back to the waves below, they all know that their lives have been permanently changed. In this town, the ceremonial thing to do is to throw the dead people over the cliff since they live on an island that does not have room for the villagers. They use this as a ceremonial to represent the waves washing away the old and bringing a new life. They know that they will build their houses stronger and bigger so as to be enough for a man like Esteban. They will paint their walls brighter and plant flowers so that someday when the ships pass by the town, they will look at the bright, beautiful, fragrant town and say, "That's Esteban's village."
Okay, that's all for the plot, and moving on to stylistic elements and literary devices. We have two examples of imagery in this short story. One of them is, the village was made up of only 20 odd wooden houses that had stone courtyards with no flowers and which were spread about on the end of a desert-like cape. There is much description about the village in this sentence. Another is, they took the mud off with grass swabs, they removed the underwater stones entangled in his hair, and they scraped the crust off with tools used for scaling fish. This sentence provides a lot of detail about the material on the drowned man. An allusion we found was, they thought that he would have had so much authority that he could have drawn fish out of the sea simply by calling their names. This is an allusion to the Bible when Jesus caught a miraculous amount of fish for the people. Alright, moving on to the next literary device, we have personification. The example is, after midnight the whistling of the wind died down and the sea fell into its Wednesday drowsiness. First of all, a wind can't whistle and the sea cannot fall asleep. Our last example of a literary device is a metaphor. Our quote is, a fuss over a drifting corpse, a drowned nobody, a piece of cold Wednesday meat. Esteban is referred to a piece of cold Wednesday meat because he has been in sea for such a long time. The theme of this short story is that new ideas have the power to result in greater changes. Because of Esteban, the people in the village made their ceilings taller and floors stronger. Their houses were painted with color and cliffs were planted with flowers. This one man brought many changes to one small village.